It was in the radiant summer light of Saint-Tropez that the story begins. Or perhaps it was the moment when a young woman walked barefoot upon the sand, the sea rising softly around her ankles, while countless unseen eyes across the world fixed upon her image. Her name was Brigitte Bardot, and in that instant she became more than a woman. She became a myth, an emblem of desire and scandal, a fragile being elevated to the heavens and cast into shadows all at once. The story of Brigitte Bardot is not simply one of beauty and fame, but one of turmoil, broken loves, restless spirit, and the haunting echo of solitude that accompanied her from Parisian salons to distant shores. Welcome, dear listener, to this telling. Share with us in the stillness of night when and where you listen, as part of a circle across time. Do not forget to subscribe, for in doing so, you keep these fragile memories alive, linking one life to another across the great silence of centuries. The streets of Paris in the early 1930s were narrow veins of stone and shadow, carrying the voices of a city that had survived a war and knew another might come. It was into this world in the autumn of 1934 that Brigitte Anne-Marie Bardot was born, a child of comfort yet touched always by the unease of her times. Her father, Louis Bardot, was a man of discipline, an industrialist whose bearing was strict and precise, while her mother, Anne-Marie Moussel, was elegant and tender, weaving music and refinement into the household. Theirs was a home where duty and appearance carried weight, where the world beyond was often held at a distance, and where Brigitte, delicate and dreamy, found both shelter and confinement. From the earliest days, she was not like other children. Those who knew her as a girl would later recall her shyness, her sensitivity so acute that even the sound of raised voices could bring tears. There was within her a fragility, but also a peculiar intensity, as though the fire of her later life already smoldered beneath the pale skin and watchful eyes. She lived in a world of lace curtains and piano melodies, yet outside, Paris was trembling with change. When the Second World War darkened Europe, Brigitte's childhood was pierced by the echo of sirens, by rationing, and by the whispered fears of adults who tried to shield their children from horrors they could not understand. It was in this atmosphere of tension and protection that her mother guided her into ballet. Dance was more than a discipline. It was an escape, a shaping of the body into grace, a training of the spirit into rhythm. From her earliest lessons, Brigitte bent herself into the forms of classical art, moving in silence to music that seemed to lift her beyond the confines of her family's home. Each step upon the wooden floors was a promise that life could be shaped, that movement could transcend the heaviness of the age. She studied at the Conservatoire de Paris, walking the strict path of aspiring ballerinas, her hair pulled tightly back, her body pushed toward perfection by the hands of teachers who demanded poise and submission. There, in those mirrored halls, the seeds of her dual nature were sown, for dance gave her both liberation and constraint. Her body was trained to obey, to bow before tradition, to fit into lines and patterns that had existed for centuries. Yet within her was the flicker of rebellion, the awareness that behind each plie and arabesque there was a longing for something wilder, freer, untamed. One wonders, did she feel even then that she was more than a dancer, more than a dutiful daughter? Did she sense that the world would one day not only watch her movements, but crave them, judge them, condemn them? Those who watched her in childhood remembered a strange combination, discipline and daydream. She was often silent, even withdrawn, and yet when she moved upon a stage, a transformation occurred. There was a radiance that could not be taught, an energy that seemed to break through her quiet demeanor. And here lies the first of her mysteries. Was this light within her, or was it the reflection of all that others wished to see? Did she truly wish to dance, or was she already being carried toward another destiny, one where her body and presence would become an object not of art alone, but of desire, of projection, of endless scrutiny? The war ended, Paris returned to its bustling rhythms, and Brigitte grew into adolescence. Her parents, mindful of their reputation, instilled in her the manners of the bourgeoisie, the rituals of appearance, the codes of conduct. Yet the world outside was changing more rapidly than they knew. Magazines, cinema, and the new allure of mass culture began to shape the dreams of the young. Brigitte's beauty, still unformed, began to attract notice. She was tall, slim, with striking eyes that seemed both innocent and knowing, and photographers soon found her. It was her mother's acquaintance with a fashion editor that first brought Brigitte before the lens. At the age of 15, she was chosen to appear on the cover of Elle magazine, her face framed by youth, her gaze carrying already that strange magnetism which would later intoxicate millions. The moment was small, seemingly insignificant, yet it opened a path. The girl who had trained to dance was now being remade by light and shadow, by the cold eye of the camera, into an image for others to consume. What did she feel in that moment? Pride? Fear? Or the first stirrings of the double life that would define her existence? The private soul hidden beneath the public mask. When one looks back upon these beginnings, one senses both inevitability and tragedy. The path from ballerina to actress, from daughter to icon, from child to symbol, appears almost written by forces beyond her control. Yet in those days she could not have known. She was still only Brigitte, walking the narrow streets of Paris, returning from lessons with sore feet, perhaps dreaming of stages she would never tread. But already the city, the nation, the world was preparing to claim her. And so we leave her here, in the quiet echo of her youth, the faint tapping of ballet shoes still resounding on wooden floors, a rhythm that will fade as new sounds arise, shutters clicking, audiences whispering, waves of adoration and condemnation swelling around her. The girl is nearly gone. The myth waits at the threshold. The blinding flash of a camera, once startling and strange, became the light that shaped her destiny. For Brigitte Bardot, what began as a simple modeling assignment soon became an awakening to the strange power of being seen, of being transformed into an image that traveled far beyond the walls of her Parisian home. The lens was unfeeling, yet it carried her into spaces where no ballet performance could have reached, into the hands of strangers who gazed upon her face without knowing her voice, her laughter, her sorrows. There is something haunting in this, is there not? To be known first as a surface, a reflection, a figure of beauty, and only later, if at all, as a soul with hidden depths. Her first appearances in Elle and other magazines were quiet in their beginnings, but they set in motion a tide. The post-war years in France were years of rebuilding, of redefining culture and desire. Women were stepping into new freedoms, yet also bearing the weight of expectations. Fashion, cinema, and celebrity were merging into a language of aspiration, and Bardot, still in her teenage years, became one of its chosen messengers. With every photograph, the boundary between her private world and the world's gaze grew thinner. It is said that in those years she was torn between obedience to her parents' wishes and the lure of this new realm of glamour. Her father was cautious, protective, anxious about the whispers that already surrounded his daughter's growing fame. Yet her mother, Anne-Marie, had a gentler eye and perhaps saw in Brigitte a chance for a destiny greater than the quiet confines of Parisian bourgeois life. Did she encourage the path, or merely allow it? The line between permission and silent complicity is delicate, and one wonders if even Brigitte understood it then. The modeling assignments multiplied. Dresses, hairstyles, the faint glimmer of lipstick, all were placed upon her young figure, and each time the photographers spoke of her unique presence. She was not merely pretty, they said. She carried a spark, a natural ease before the lens that was rare and unsettling. Unlike other models, she did not pose with stiff elegance. She seemed instead to melt into the moment, to live inside the picture. The world called it natural sensuality, yet perhaps it was simply her refusal to disguise her own self. She was not yet acting, but she was no longer fully herself. And then, as the years of adolescence gave way to early womanhood, the line between modeling and cinema blurred. Paris in the late 1940s and early 1950s was alive with the hum of film studios, the stir of directors seeking fresh faces, new icons for a generation weary of old traditions. Brigitte was noticed by Roger Vadim, then still an assistant in the industry, a man whose gaze upon her would alter not only her career, but her entire life. Vadim was captivated by her beauty, yes, but also by her spirit. Untamed, vibrant, unwilling to be confined by the stiff conventions of the day. He saw in her the possibility of something revolutionary. Yet before Vadim's full influence could shape her, she walked a careful path. Her family hesitated at the thought of cinema, fearing scandal, fearing the loss of respectability. But the lure of the screen was powerful. In 1952, she made her first steps into film, still small roles, uncertain, barely noticed beyond a few critics and curious audiences. The transition was not immediate, nor was her talent yet polished. She was learning to move not only for the eye of a photographer, but for the gaze of the moving camera, which demanded something different: soul, voice, rhythm of presence. She did not yet know that the camera would devour her whole. At this time, she balanced two worlds. There was still the quiet discipline of dance, the memory of childhood lessons pressing upon her posture, her gestures, even her silences. And there was the growing intoxication of fame, the knowledge that the world was beginning to whisper her name. How heavy must that have felt for a young woman of only 17 or 18 to feel the pull of destiny while still trapped in the anxieties of youth? We cannot know, and perhaps she herself did not fully grasp it, but we sense it in her earliest films, where hesitation and confidence mingle in equal measure. It is tempting to imagine Brigitte in those early days walking through the streets of Paris, her image already appearing in shop windows, on magazine racks, while she herself was still simply a girl, trying to understand love, duty, and self. Did she look at those glossy covers and recognize herself? Or did she feel estranged, as though the smiling figure upon the page was someone else entirely, a creation of light and shadow that no longer belonged to her? The 1950s in France were turbulent years of cultural renewal. America's influence pressed upon Europe with music, cinema, and style, and yet France sought its own symbols of modernity, its own language of youth and sensuality. Bardot, though still young and unformed, was swept into this tide. She was both chosen and trapped, lifted into the role of national emblem before she even knew the weight of the crown. The flash of the camera had become her companion, her shaper, her judge. And yet, within her, there remained that same contradiction, the shy, fragile child who cried at raised voices, and the woman who could, with a single glance, command the attention of millions. This duality is the essence of her story, and it began here, in the blinding light of the studio, where a girl first became an image, and an image began to unravel a soul. As her modeling career grew, so too did her connection with Vadim, who whispered of futures far greater than what her parents had imagined for her. In his gaze she found encouragement, perhaps even a dangerous kind of freedom, for he urged her not to be constrained, not to bow before tradition. It was through him that she stepped fully into cinema, that she would one day ignite revolutions of desire and morality. But for now, in these early years, she was still learning how to stand before the camera, how to let it consume her while trying not to vanish entirely. The light of the flash still lingers in our minds, blinding, brilliant, and unrelenting. It is in this light that Brigitte Bardot first learned what it meant to be both seen and unseen, adored and objectified, liberated and confined. The camera had claimed her, and the world, unknowingly, was preparing to follow. And so, let us leave her here. Her image frozen in a photograph, the moment suspended, the brightness leaving after images in our eyes. From this flash will come cinema, scandal, and storm. But for now, the bulb has only just burst, and its glow has not yet faded. The flicker of a projector bulb casts its pale rhythm upon a darkened wall, light breaking into fragments, shadows quivering, and in that trembling space Brigitte Bardot first appeared as more than a still image, more than the frozen beauty of a magazine cover. On the screen she moved, she breathed, her presence carried across a room where strangers sat in silence, their eyes drawn to her gestures, their ears straining to catch her voice. It was not yet the thunderous debut that would shake the world, but a beginning, hesitant and uncertain, like the first tentative steps onto a stage that is both welcoming and merciless. Her earliest film roles were small, scattered across the early 1950s, films made by directors who perhaps saw in her something that could attract, something that could stir curiosity, even if they had not yet grasped the force of what she carried within her. In these films, she was often cast as the ingénue, the charming girl on the edge of the story, a presence more decorative than defining. Yet even in such roles, audiences could not help but notice her. There was a lightness in the way she moved, an unstudied authenticity that set her apart from actresses, trained in the rigid traditions of stage and screen. It was not yet acting in the fullest sense. She herself confessed that she did not always feel like an actress, that she was simply being, letting the camera observe her without pretense. This unpolished quality unsettled some critics who looked for technique, for craft, for the careful construction of a character. But others, watching her, saw something more primal. They saw truth, and truth, when it is embodied by beauty, carries a weight far greater than artifice. In these early films, Brigitte was learning without knowing she was learning. The presence of the camera was no longer the sudden assault of the flashbulb. It was a living companion, watching her every move, magnifying her smallest gesture, turning each smile into a revelation. Yet the flicker of the projector bulb also revealed her vulnerability. Her voice, still soft and uncertain, sometimes betrayed nerves, her gaze occasionally averted, as though the intensity of being observed was too much to bear. Did she, in those moments, wonder whether this was truly her path? Or was she carried forward by momentum, by others' ambitions, by a fate she could not escape? Paris at that time was restless with artistic change, new directors, new styles, the whispers of what would soon become the French New Wave. Cinema was no longer merely grand costume dramas or polished studio productions. It was becoming a mirror of life itself, raw, unfiltered, intimate. Bardot, with her natural manner, her lack of studied theatricality, fit into this shift like a figure destined for it. She did not have to force herself into these new molds. She already embodied them, though she may not have known it. Her personal life, too, was entwined with her cinematic beginnings. Roger Vadim, the man who would later direct her in the film that would change everything, was already whispering of possibilities, of the revolution she might bring simply by being herself on screen. He was captivated not only by her beauty, but by the restless spirit behind it, the refusal to bend to convention. For Vadim, Bardot was not just an actress. She was a force waiting to be unleashed, and he began to shape her path with both lover's devotion and director's vision. But before the storm, there was the uncertainty of these first steps. Films such as Le Trou Normand in 1952 introduced her to audiences, though only as a glimmer, a presence among others. She did not yet carry the story, but her figure lingered in memory, a promise not fully revealed, and as she appeared again in Menina, the girl in the bikini, the world saw her in the simplicity of youth, a body unadorned, moving through sunlight and sea. The camera adored her, though the full implications of this adoration were not yet clear. How strange it must have felt to watch herself upon a screen, to see her image larger than life, her movements projected into the darkness of a cinema hall. Did she recognize herself? Or did she see a stranger, a double, a creation of light that no longer belonged to her? For this is the paradox of cinema. It gives the illusion of truth, yet it creates a distance, a separation between self and image that can be haunting, even unbearable. Bardot was at the beginning of this haunting, still perhaps delighted, still uncertain, still naive to the enormity of what awaited her. The projector bulb flickered on, and audiences began to murmur. Who was this young woman, this girl whose beauty seemed effortless, whose presence seemed at once innocent and suggestive? The whispers began to spread beyond Paris, across Europe, and soon across oceans. Hollywood, too, began to glance toward her, sensing that here was someone who might captivate even their restless public. Yet for Bardot, these years were still years of becoming, years of apprenticeship to a craft she did not even fully believe she possessed. And in the midst of this, the contradictions of her character deepened. She was still painfully shy in private, still often overcome by tears, still unsure of herself beyond the camera's gaze. Yet on screen, she radiated confidence, sensuality, a freedom of movement that seemed to defy convention. Was this the birth of her artistry? Not through deliberate craft, but through the very tension between her inner fragility and her outward liberation. Perhaps it is this contradiction that made her unforgettable, for in her we see not the polished mask of an actress, but the raw exposure of a soul torn between fear and abandon. These first films did not make her a global star, but they were the seeds. The flicker of the projector bulb had announced her arrival, had whispered her name to audiences who did not yet know how fully they would come to worship or condemn her. And for Brigitte, each film was another step away from the wooden floors of the ballet studio, another step into a realm where light and shadow would define her life. And so we leave her here, caught in that flickering light, uncertain, luminous, unformed. The bulb hums, the reel turns, the audience leans forward, sensing that something is coming, though they cannot yet name it. The film ends, the credits roll, but the image of her lingers, unresolved, as though awaiting the storm that will follow. The whispers rising in crowded cinema halls carried with them both curiosity and unease, for audiences knew they were witnessing not only the unfolding of a story upon the screen, but also the birth of something greater, something that unsettled the boundaries of art and morality. The year was 1956, and the film was Et Dieu, Créa la femme, or In God Created Woman, directed by Roger Vadim. This was no ordinary production, nor was Brigitte Bardot's role that of a decorative figure moving along the periphery of a tale. It was a declaration, a storm that broke across France and beyond, marking a turning point not only in her life, but in cinema itself. In that film, Bardot did not merely act. She existed upon the screen with a vitality and sensuality that defied the conventions of the time. She played Juliet, a young woman whose desires were unrestrained, whose spirit refused the confines of polite society. In her movements, in the way she walked barefoot upon sunlit streets, in the way her hair fell loose as though touched by the sea breeze, she embodied freedom. Yet in that freedom was also danger, for the character of Juliet did not seek redemption or concealment. She was unapologetic in her sensuality, in her will to live according to her own nature. Audiences gasped, critics argued, moralists denounced, and yet no one could look away. The whispers filled the cinema halls as if the viewers themselves were complicit in a transgression, as if by watching they too had crossed a threshold into forbidden territory. Was this still cinema, or was it a challenge to the very structures of society? That question haunted the days and nights following the film's release, as Bardot's image spread across the world, plastered upon posters, whispered in homes, debated in churches, celebrated in cafes. For Bardot, the experience was transformative and devastating. Until then, she had been a rising star, a young actress still searching for her place. Within God-created woman, she became an icon, a symbol not only of beauty but of rebellion. The film stripped away the polite veils of mid-century morality and revealed a woman who lived by her desires, and in doing so, it forced audiences to confront their own. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some saw her as a goddess of liberation, others as a dangerous siren luring society into decadence. Brigitte herself was caught between these interpretations, praised and condemned in equal measure, loved and vilified as though she were no longer a person, but an embodiment of cultural upheaval. The controversy was not confined to France. Across the Atlantic, in America, where cinema was both adored and policed, the film stirred scandal. The Catholic Legion of Decency denounced it, calling it immoral, indecent, corrupting. Yet in the very act of condemnation, they ensured its notoriety, and the name of Brigitte Bardot became known in cities and towns far removed from the shores of Saint-Tropez. For many, she was the French answer to Marilyn Monroe, yet different. Less sculpted, less polished, more raw, more dangerous. Monroe's sensuality was wrapped in the glamour of Hollywood. Bardot's was barefoot, sunburned, untamed. It is easy, in hindsight, to see this moment as inevitable. But imagine for a moment the young woman at the center of it. Barely in her 20s, suddenly burdened with the weight of a symbol she had not consciously chosen, she became the focus of both adoration and hatred. Could she have anticipated the magnitude of this transformation? Could she have known that a single role would define her in the eyes of millions, binding her to a myth she could never escape? Perhaps in the quiet hours after the frenzy of the premiere, she felt the tremors of fear beneath the triumph. For to be placed upon such a pedestal is also to be trapped, unable to step down without shattering both oneself and the illusions of others. The film's success catapulted her into international stardom, and with it came the relentless gaze of the press. Paparazzi followed her every move, her private life dissected, her affairs speculated upon, her very existence transformed into spectacle. She became, in the words of one critic, the face of a new morality, though it is doubtful she ever sought to carry such a mantle. What she wanted, perhaps, was freedom, to live, to love, to express. Yet the world transformed that desire into an emblem, both worshipped and scorned. In and God-created woman, Bardot revealed something essential not only about herself, but about the shifting tides of the 20th century. The 1950s were a decade of contradictions, of strict social codes coexisting with undercurrents of rebellion, of prosperity masking discontent. Bardot's Juliet was a mirror held up to this world, reflecting the yearning for liberation that simmered beneath the surface. Was it art that created her, or was it society itself, desperate for a figure who could embody what it dared not speak aloud? The question lingers, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The whispers in the cinema halls did not fade with time. They grew into roars of fascination and debate. Bardot was no longer merely an actress. She was now a phenomenon, a symbol of the sexual revolution before the revolution had even been named. She embodied both the promise and the peril of freedom, the allure and the fear of desire unchained. And as she stood at the center of this storm, one wonders whether she felt empowered or imprisoned. Was she the creator of her destiny, or had she become the creation of others' longings, a mirror in which countless fantasies and fears were reflected? What remains certain is that with and God-created woman, the course of her life was irrevocably altered. The whispers had become shouts, the debates had spread across continents, and Bardot, whether she willed it or not, had become a legend. Yet legends are rarely kind to those who bear them. Already, the price of her new identity was beginning to show in the restless glances, the weariness in her voice, the unspoken awareness that she could no longer return to the quiet obscurity of her earlier years. And so we leave her here, the film still playing in the darkened hall, the audience leaning forward, their whispers rising into a crescendo that will echo for decades. The light of the projector lingers upon her face, frozen in a moment of both triumph and entrapment. And as the reel ends, the sound of applause is mingled with the murmur of disquiet, unresolved, lingering in the shadows. The echo of applause fading into silence is often more haunting than the applause itself. For Brigitte Bardot, the thunder that followed, and God-created woman, eventually gave way to quiet moments in which the enormity of her fame pressed upon her chest like a weight too heavy to carry. In the stillness that followed the storm of acclaim and scandal, she began to taste both the sweetness and the bitterness of the life into which she had been thrust. The applause had made her a star, but the silence revealed the loneliness of such a height. With the film's success, Bardot was sought after by directors, producers, and journalists from across the world. Paris, Rome, London, and Hollywood beckoned, each city offering new stages upon which she could perform, new roles that might cement her status or challenge her image. Yet wherever she went, she carried the ghost of Juliet, the wild and free woman she had embodied in Vadim's film. Audiences demanded more of the same, and the press expected her life to mirror her roles. Thus began the entanglement of her identity with her performances, until the lines between Brigitte the actress and Brigitte the woman blurred into indistinction. Hollywood in particular watched her with hungry eyes. American cinema, still holding tightly to its codes of glamour and morality, was fascinated by this young Frenchwoman who seemed to defy restraint. She was courted for roles, invited to studios, yet her relationship with the American industry was always uneasy. For Hollywood wished to polish her, to mold her into its own star system, while Bardot resisted confinement. Her allure lay precisely in her refusal to be sculpted into perfection. She was not the carefully lit, carefully posed goddess of the Hollywood screen, but a creature of sunlight and shadows, of laughter and tears unhidden. It was this naturalness that captivated audiences, and it was this same quality that eluded the control of those who sought to own her image. In Europe, she flourished in films that allowed her to explore variations of the sensual, rebellious spirit that had made her famous. Directors knew that placing her upon the screen meant immediate attention, immediate controversy, immediate profit. Yet behind the commercial calculations was a young woman still learning who she was. She once admitted that she often did not act so much as live upon the screen, letting her own emotions flow into the characters. This authenticity gave her performances their power, but it also exposed her to wounds. For when she suffered in her roles, she suffered in herself. And when she was desired as a character, it was she, Brigitte, who bore the weight of that desire. The silence after the applause also revealed the cost of being desired by the world. Everywhere she went, she was pursued by photographers, by admirers, by those who wished to touch, to claim, to possess. Her life in Paris became difficult. Her retreats to Saint-Tropez less an escape than a besieged refuge. Friends and lovers came and went, but few understood the isolation of being an icon. To be seen by all is often to be known by none. Did she, in the quiet of her rooms, feel the ache of this paradox? Did she wonder whether the freedom she represented on screen was slipping further from her in reality? Her relationships began to falter under the strain of fame. The marriage to Roger Vadim, which had carried her into the world of cinema, was already fraying. The very film that made her immortal had also exposed their private life to scrutiny, and the intensity of Bardot's allure drew attention from other men and sparked jealousies impossible to silence. In later years, she would speak of her restlessness, her inability to remain bound, her search for something always just beyond her reach. Love for her was both a refuge and a battlefield, a place of passion and destruction. In these years of ascent, she was already beginning to understand that intimacy was nearly impossible for one whose life had become a public spectacle. And yet, in the midst of this turbulence, Bardot continued to rise. She became a fixture not only of cinema, but of fashion, music, and the broader culture of the 1950s and 1960s. Young women imitated her hair, her clothes, her manner of walking. Young men idolized her as the embodiment of modern desire. She was not simply an actress, she was a cultural revolution made flesh. But revolutions are rarely kind to their symbols, and Bardot found herself trapped within the image of liberation. Was she free, or was she the prisoner of the very myth that celebrated her? The silence after applause is also the space where doubt enters. Bardot was often filled with melancholy, with the sense that her fame was hollow, her performances misunderstood. She had longed, in her youth, for the grace of ballet, for the purity of art, yet now she was reduced in the eyes of many to a body, a face, a fantasy. Critics dismissed her acting as secondary to her beauty. Audiences conflated her characters with her true self, and moralists attacked her as a corrupter of values. In such a world, where could she find her own voice, her own identity? And still she worked, appearing in films that tested the boundaries of what was permissible, films that showcased not only her sensuality, but also her defiance. Directors like Henri-Georges Clouzot and Jean-Luc Godard would later draw from her something more profound. But in these early years, after "And God Created Woman," she remained caught between the storm of expectation and the fragile search for self. Imagine her, then, after a premiere, walking from the blinding lights of the cinema into the quiet of a hotel room, the applause still ringing in her ears, fading now into the hum of the night. She removes her dress, wipes away the layers of makeup, stares into a mirror. Does she recognize the woman staring back, or is it already a stranger, an invention of the public? The silence answers her, not with clarity, but with an ache that will follow her through the decades. And so we leave her here, standing in that silence after the applause, caught between triumph and loneliness, between the adoration of millions and the solitude of self. The sound of clapping has vanished, leaving only the faint hum of the night, unresolved, as though waiting for the next performance, the next scandal, the next cry of the world. The smell of salt and cigarettes in the air belongs to an age of freedom, of bodies stretched upon warm sand, of laughter drifting from cafes where the smoke of Gauloises mingled with the sea breeze. For Brigitte Bardot, this was not merely atmosphere, it was identity. For she became the very embodiment of the cultural revolution that swept through Europe in the late 1950s and early 1960s. No longer confined to the rigid patterns of the past, youth sought new ways of living, and Bardot's figure, tanned by the Mediterranean sun and crowned with unkempt golden hair, became its most potent symbol. The bikini, once scandalous, was now worn with ease upon her body. In Saint-Tropez, the small fishing village she had helped transform into a shrine of modern hedonism, Bardot walked barefoot, unguarded, often trailed by photographers who captured her not as an actress on set, but as a living emblem of liberation. To see her was to believe that a new world was possible, one in which women were no longer confined by corsets, traditions, or the silent expectations of respectability. Yet this image, radiant and intoxicating, also concealed a deeper question. Was she truly free, or had she become a prisoner of the freedom she was said to represent? Her films of this period reflected this duality. On one hand, they showcased Bardot as the liberated woman, unafraid of desire, unafraid to challenge male authority, unafraid to inhabit her body fully. On the other hand, they often trapped her within narratives that reduced her to an object, a fantasy projected upon her by directors and audiences alike. She was praised for shattering taboos, yet criticized for embodying them too easily. Thus, the paradox of Bardot grew sharper. She was both the liberator and the imprisoned, both the symbol of emancipation and the subject of endless objectification. In the cafes of Paris, intellectuals debated what she meant. Some, like Simone de Beauvoir, saw her as a phenomenon, a mirror of modern womanhood's contradictions, a figure who exposed the tensions between independence and desire. Others dismissed her as a passing distraction, a body elevated by publicity rather than talent. And yet, whether celebrated or dismissed, no one could ignore her. Bardot was everywhere, in magazines, on posters, in songs, even in the way young women tied their hair or painted their eyes. She was no longer simply an actress. She was an atmosphere, a presence that saturated the culture of the age. Yet what did it mean for her, the woman behind the myth, to carry such weight? Imagine her walking through the narrow streets of Saint-Tropez, the scent of salt upon her skin, the smoke of a cigarette trailing behind her. She smiles for the camera, she laughs with friends, she dances at parties where music lingers until dawn. But in quieter hours, when the shutters are drawn and the sea lies dark beyond the window, did she not wonder whether all of this joy was borrowed, whether it could ever fill the spaces of loneliness that fame had carved within her? Her relationships during this time revealed the turbulence beneath the sunlit surface. Lovers came and went, drawn to her radiance yet unable to hold it, for Bardot's spirit was restless, always reaching for something beyond. She was accused of recklessness, of cruelty, of leaving behind broken hearts without remorse. But perhaps these accusations missed the truth. Perhaps it was not indifference that drove her, but the unbearable pressure of being perpetually desired, perpetually consumed by others. To be wanted by all is often to be unable to belong to anyone. The smell of salt and cigarettes was not only the fragrance of liberation, but also of escape. Bardot retreated often to Saint-Tropez because Paris, with its constant scrutiny, became suffocating. Here, she could at least pretend to live freely, even as photographers camped outside her villa, even as admirers flooded the small village. The paradox never left her. The more she sought freedom, the more she became trapped by the myth of her freedom. She wanted to live simply, yet she had become the most watched woman of her generation. Cinema, too, began to shift in response to her presence. Directors realized that to cast Bardot was not only to tell a story, but to create a cultural event. Her very appearance on screen stirred debates about morality, modernity, and the future of womanhood. Was she leading the charge into a new world, or was she merely reflecting desires that had long been hidden, now brought into the open by the shifting tides of history? Perhaps both were true. And so the age of Bardot became inseparable from the age of rebellion. The late 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and the winds of change blew stronger. Rock and roll, new philosophies, new politics, youth everywhere rejected the silence of their parents and sought voices of their own. In this chorus of rebellion, Bardot's image was like a banner waving in the sunlight, beautiful and defiant. Yet unlike banners, she was human, and her fragility remained hidden behind the fabric of myth. Did she know, as she sat upon the beach, the sand clinging to her skin, the cigarette burning down between her fingers, that she was shaping the imagination of an entire generation? Or was she simply living, unaware that her choices, her gestures, her very being were being transformed into symbols by others? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between. The smell of salt and cigarettes drifts away now, leaving us with the lingering sense of both liberation and melancholy. For in this period of cultural revolution, Bardot shone brightest, yet her inner shadows also deepened. She became the dream of millions, yet dreams are fleeting, and their beauty is always haunted by the knowledge that they will dissolve at dawn. And so we leave her here, on the shores of Saint-Tropez, the waves breaking endlessly, the smoke of a cigarette curling into the evening air. Around her, laughter and music rise from the cafes, but in the silence beneath it all, the question remains: was she free? Or was she only ever an image of freedom, trapped in the gaze of a world that would not release her? The slam of a door left half open is a sound that lingers longer than its echo, carrying with it the weight of passions unresolved, of love that blazes into anger, of intimacy that collapses into solitude. For Brigitte Bardot, the doors of her life seemed always to open and close with this sound, for love entered quickly, consumed brightly, and often departed with violence or despair. The myth of Bardot was not only written in cinema and in the eyes of audiences, but also in the fragile and storm-ridden realm of her heart. Her early marriage to Roger Vadim had bound her not only to a man, but to the destiny of cinema itself. He was the one who had first seen her not only as a young woman, but as a force, who placed her before the world in a God-created woman. Yet the very film that immortalized her also fractured their union. For how could love survive when it was lived under the glare of 1,000 eyes, when private tenderness was consumed by public scandal? Vadim was older, ambitious, and restless, and Bardot, though devoted in her way, was equally restless, equally unwilling to be contained. What might have been a partnership of love became a crucible of creation and destruction, and when the door finally slammed shut on their marriage, it was not with gentle farewell, but with echoes that followed her for years. From Vadim she drifted into other arms, other embraces, each promising shelter, each unable to hold her. She loved intensely, she gave herself fully in moments, yet she seemed always to awaken to a hunger that love alone could not satisfy. Critics, gossip columns, and moralists condemned her for this, calling her reckless, selfish, even cruel. They painted her as a siren, a destroyer of men. But was it truly cruelty? Or was it the inevitability of a spirit too free, too wounded, too restless to remain bound? Among her lovers were actors, musicians, artists, men who themselves were drawn to the fire of fame, men who desired not only her body but the aura that surrounded her. Yet to desire Bardot was to confront the impossibility of possessing her. For how can one hold what the entire world claims as its own? How can intimacy survive when every kiss, every glance is shadowed by the gaze of strangers? Perhaps this is why her loves collapsed so often, leaving behind both passion and ruin, both tenderness and despair. The gossip that followed her was relentless. Newspapers filled their pages with tales of her affairs, some true, others imagined, all feeding the insatiable hunger of a world that wished to consume not only her films, but her life itself. She became less a woman in the eyes of the public than a spectacle of desire, a living story upon which strangers could project their own longings and judgments. In such a world, how could love ever remain pure? How could affection survive when it was constantly invaded by rumor and scrutiny? And yet, within her, the need for love never ceased. She once confessed that she loved love itself, that she was incapable of living without passion. For her, to be alive was to be in love, and when love failed, life itself seemed unbearable. This truth would follow her through years of sorrow, even to the edge of despair, where thoughts of ending her own life would sometimes whisper. But in these early years, it was not despair but restlessness that drove her. Restlessness that closed one door even as another was opening, each slam echoing into the next beginning. What are we to make of this? Was Bardot a victim of her circumstances, a fragile soul torn apart by the demands of fame? Or was she the agent of her own choices, defying the conventions of a world that demanded she remain faithful, silent, respectable? Perhaps both are true. Perhaps her loves were both genuine and destructive, both liberating and imprisoning. The slam of each door was both her act of rebellion and her cry of sorrow. Imagine her then, in an apartment in Paris, the air heavy with the scent of perfume and smoke, a lover's quarrel ending in shouted words, the door slamming shut as footsteps fade down the staircase. She collapses onto a chair, tears in her eyes, the silence of the room pressing upon her. Outside, photographers wait, ready to capture her leaving for the next appointment, the next party, the next film set. Inside, she is simply Brigitte, a woman longing for tenderness, wounded by the very passions that once sustained her. Her films of this period reflected these storms. She often played women torn between love and freedom, between passion and despair. Was it art imitating life, or life imitating art? The boundary was blurred, for her performances carried the weight of her own heartache, her own longings. When she wept on screen, audiences saw not only a character, but Bardot herself, fragile beneath the myth. As the years passed, the pattern repeated, doors opening, closing, slamming, always half open for the next possibility. Some lovers sought to tame her, others to bask in her radiance, but none could hold her completely. And through it all, the public watched, judged, and consumed, as though her personal life were another film for their entertainment. The applause of cinema was mirrored by the whispers of gossip, and both echoed endlessly in her ears. And so we leave her here, in the corridor of memory, where doors stand half open, half closed, their hinges still trembling from the force of their slamming. Behind each door lies a story of passion and sorrow, of love given and withdrawn, of freedom sought and never fully found. The echoes remain, unresolved, lingering in the silence of her restless heart. The scratching sound of a pen writing her name belongs to the quiet realm of contracts, scripts, letters, and promises. A world where the intimacy of ink upon paper binds lives as surely as a clasped hand or a kiss. For Brigitte Bardot, the pen became both a chain and a gateway, for it was through signatures and written words that she entered new roles, new alliances, and new bonds that blurred the boundaries between love and creation. And at the center of this weaving was still Roger Vadim, the man who had once taken her from the mirrored halls of ballet and placed her beneath the scorching light of cinema. Though their marriage had dissolved, Vadim's presence lingered, written into her destiny as indelibly as her own name upon a page. He had discovered her, shaped her, and in a sense, inscribed her into history. His pen was not merely that of a lover, but of a writer and director, and each stroke of his imagination carved another facet of Bardot's myth. To him, she was muse, inspiration, and creation all at once. And though she would resist being possessed, she could not escape the gravitational pull of the man who had first revealed her to the world. Their relationship was both tender and destructive, filled with betrayals and reconciliations, with nights of passion followed by mornings of estrangement. Vadim understood her restlessness, her need for freedom, perhaps better than any other. But he also understood how to channel that wildness into art. His scripts, his visions, his words on paper became the mirrors in which Bardot saw herself reflected, and though she longed to escape his influence, she often returned to it, as though compelled by a force beyond reason. The scratching of his pen was a sound that shaped her life, binding her even when she sought to break free. Beyond Vadim, there were other pens that wrote her name: contracts with producers, articles in newspapers, love letters that crossed oceans, gossip columns that carved judgments into the public record. Each time her name was written, it seemed to carry more weight, as though the letters themselves were no longer hers, but the world's. To sign a contract was to surrender months of her life, her body, her image. To see her name in print was to watch it become an object of desire and debate, untethered from the fragile woman who bore it. Even her own hand, when it signed letters or notes, must have felt sometimes estranged, as though the name she wrote belonged to someone she was expected to be, but could never fully inhabit. In these years, Bardot's career flourished under the ink of such agreements. Films multiplied, each bearing her image, each promising audiences another glimpse of the figure they could not resist. Yet behind the glamour of the screen lay the weary repetition of reading scripts, signing papers, attending endless meetings where her future was decided not in the intimacy of love but in the scratching of pens across pages. The world adored her, but the machinery of fame was cold, mechanical, indifferent to the frailty of the human soul. It is worth pausing to imagine her at a desk, the afternoon sun filtering through shutters, the paper before her waiting, perhaps a script filled with words others had written for her to speak, perhaps a contract binding her to obligations she did not truly wish to fulfill, perhaps a letter, trembling with the emotions she could not express in public, written to a lover who would soon depart. The scratching of the pen is delicate, but in its softness lies the permanence of decisions that cannot be undone. Her love life, too, was inscribed by words. Lovers wrote to her, promising devotion, swearing fidelity, pleading for forgiveness. Yet how many of those words survived the test of passion's passing? How many promises, once written, dissolved like ink in water when faced with the storms of desire? For Bardot, love was never still, never secure. It was always in motion, always tearing through boundaries, leaving behind fragments of letters, signatures, and words that no longer held truth. And so the pen became both instrument of creation and of loss. It created films, it created myths, it created connections that would endure in memory. But it also created prisons of obligation, records of betrayals, and shadows of broken oaths. The very act of writing her name was both empowerment and surrender, for each signature marked another fragment of herself given away to the world. As her fame grew, so too did the weight of her name in print. Newspapers across the world carried it daily, pairing it with headlines of scandal, photographs of her walking with this man or that, stories of her affairs, her quarrels, her joys, her sorrows. To open a paper was to see herself refracted in endless distortions, her private life reduced to ink and rumor. Did she, in those moments, ever long for anonymity, for a world in which her name could be written quietly, without consequence, without echo? And yet perhaps she also understood that without these scratches of the pen, she would not exist as the world knew her. To be forgotten, to be erased, might have been even more unbearable. For what is the life of a star if not a constellation of words and images strung together in the memories of others? Bardot's destiny was to live within that constellation, to be written and rewritten by the pens of lovers, directors, journalists, and admirers who would never cease inscribing her into their stories. The scratching of the pen, faint yet insistent, fades now into silence. It leaves behind pages filled with her name, promises made, roles accepted, lives intertwined. Some of these pages remain preserved, framed in archives or bound in books. Others were torn, discarded, forgotten. But all of them together form the story of a woman whose existence was never entirely her own, whose identity was always partly written by the hands of others. And so we leave her here, in the quiet after the scratching has ceased, the ink still drying upon the page, her name glistening in the fading light. The pen rests, but the story it has written continues to bind her, leading to new scandals, new creations, new wounds. The silence that follows is fragile, as though awaiting the next sound, the rustle of paper, the cry of headlines, the tearing of words in the wind. Torn newspaper pages drifting in the wind carry not only the faint smell of ink and dust, but also the fragments of stories that were once urgent, once believed, once devoured by eyes eager for scandal. For Brigitte Bardot, these pages became an inescapable mirror, a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own, but a public narrative endlessly written, torn apart, and rewritten again. The tabloids circled her like restless birds, plucking from her existence whatever pieces might feed the hunger of the masses. Love affairs, quarrels, whispered betrayals, each was captured in headlines, magnified, distorted, and carried upon the wind until truth and invention were indistinguishable. The cruelty of these torn pages lay not only in their fabrication, but in their persistence. Bardot's name was printed so often, so casually, that it seemed to lose its connection to the woman herself. She was no longer Brigitte, the fragile soul who wept in solitude, but Bardot, the myth, the scandal, the figure upon whom strangers projected their fantasies and their scorn. When she walked through the streets, the gaze of passers-by carried with it the weight of stories read in yesterday's paper. When she dined in a cafe, whispers rose like smoke, each carrying a different version of who she was. How does one live when one's reflection is scattered into 1,000 distorted fragments? The 1950s and early 1960s were a time when celebrity journalism grew into a relentless industry, and Bardot, with her beauty and her unguarded manner, became its perfect subject. Photographers lurked outside her home, followed her on holidays, intruded upon her moments of rest. No space was sacred, no time her own. Lovers who entered her life became instantly enmeshed in the machinery of gossip, their names printed alongside hers, their private gestures made public property. The act of falling in love with Bardot was not only an affair of the heart, it was a transaction with the world, for one could not love her without being exposed to the glare of headlines. The torn pages carried judgments as well as fascination. While some celebrated her as the herald of a new freedom, others condemned her as the very embodiment of decadence. She was accused of destroying marriages, of corrupting youth, of being frivolous, selfish, unfit for respect. These accusations, printed in bold letters, became part of the fabric of her existence. Whether true or false, they clung to her like shadows, impossible to shake off. Was she guilty of these sins, or were they projections of a society that feared the freedom she represented? Perhaps the answer lies not in the pages themselves, but in the silence of the woman who endured them. For Bardot rarely defended herself. She did not chase after corrections, did not fight to untangle truth from rumor. Perhaps she understood that in the world of scandal, denial only feeds the flame. Or perhaps she was simply weary, resigned to the inevitability of being misunderstood. In her silence lay both strength and fragility. Strength in her refusal to bow before gossip, fragility in her quiet surrender to its suffocating weight. The impact of this endless scrutiny was not confined to reputation alone. It seeped into her very being. Friends spoke of her mood swings, her moments of laughter that could quickly dissolve into tears. Lovers spoke of her vulnerability, her need for tenderness amidst the storm. The newspapers painted her as reckless and heartless, but those who knew her saw the opposite. A woman deeply wounded by the very attention that had lifted her to fame. The torn pages drifting in the wind were not harmless debris. They were shards that cut into her, leaving scars invisible to the eye but heavy upon the soul. And yet, the paradox deepened. For these very pages also sustained her fame, kept her name alive in the minds of millions, ensured that her films would draw crowds, that her image would remain etched into the culture of her time. She was trapped in a cycle where the gossip that wounded her also preserved her legend. Without the torn pages, perhaps she might have been freer, but she might also have been forgotten. Is this not the cruelest irony, that the same forces that destroy can also immortalize? The newspapers also played upon her image as the eternal temptress, framing her as a rival to other icons, most often Marilyn Monroe. Comparisons filled the columns, the French and the American, the untamed and the manufactured, the barefoot and the jeweled. These comparisons flattened both women into archetypes, ignoring their humanity, reducing them to symbols in a cultural debate neither had chosen. And yet the torn pages carried these comparisons across oceans, weaving Bardot into the fabric of global myth. In Saint-Tropez, the wind sometimes carried the sound of the sea, along with the rustle of papers discarded by tourists. One can imagine Bardot walking along the shore, her hair tangled by the breeze, catching sight of a page torn from a magazine, her own face staring back at her with some fabricated headline. Did she laugh at the absurdity? Did she sigh at the inevitability? Or did she simply look away, unwilling to meet the gaze of her own distorted reflection? The torn pages drifting in the wind remind us that history itself is fragile, composed of fragments that may or may not hold truth. For Bardot, the fragments became the story, the myth overshadowing the reality, until even she might have struggled to separate the two. Perhaps this is why her later years would be marked by retreat, by withdrawal from the gaze that had once adored her. For how long can one endure being scattered into pieces, each carried away by winds beyond control? And so we leave her here, the papers still rustling, the headlines still bold, the ink still staining her name. They drift across the streets of Paris, across the beaches of Saint-Tropez, across oceans, carrying with them both fascination and cruelty. And as they scatter, unresolved, they leave behind the faint sound of fluttering, a reminder that Bardot's life was never still, never whole, always torn into fragments drifting in the restless wind. A mirror reflecting too many faces at once does not reveal clarity but confusion, for in its surface one cannot distinguish which reflection is true, which belongs to the self, and which to the strangers who gaze upon it. For Brigitte Bardot, the mirror became a battlefield of identities, for she was never only herself when she looked into it. She was the image the world demanded, the rival to other women elevated into icons, the eternal comparison, the subject of endless debate. In those years when her fame was at its zenith, she found herself constantly measured against others, most often against Marilyn Monroe, as though two women could somehow embody the entirety of a century's fantasies and contradictions. Monroe and Bardot, the American and the French, the blonde of Hollywood's polished glamour, and the barefoot goddess of Saint-Tropez. Newspapers loved to frame them as opposites, as rivals, as symbols of competing worlds. Marilyn was the studio creation, carefully lit and directed, her fragility masked beneath orchestrated performances. Bardot was the untamed spirit, seemingly natural, careless, embodying the illusion of authenticity. Yet beneath these contrasts lay a deeper truth, Both were women trapped in the same paradox, adored and consumed by the gaze of men, worshipped as symbols of liberation, while privately haunted by loneliness and despair. In the mirror of comparisons, Bardot could not escape her reflection. She was told she was freer than Marilyn, that she represented something bolder, more modern. Yet freedom, when defined by others, can feel like another cage. She had not chosen to be compared, to be set against another woman as though their value lay only in contrast. Did she look into the mirror, see her own face multiplied into 1,000 distortions, and wonder which of them was truly hers? Other comparisons abounded as well. Within France, she was set against actresses like Jeanne Moreau, Catherine Deneuve, and others who represented different facets of femininity. Moreau was seen as intellectual, Deneuve as elegant and aloof, Bardot as sensual and wild. Each woman bore her own burden of expectation, but Bardot's was the heaviest, for she was seen not merely as an actress, but as a revolution in herself. The mirror reflected not her features, but the desires of an entire age, projected upon her with merciless intensity. This endless measuring seeped into her work. Directors used her image consciously, framing her as the embodiment of youth and rebellion, crafting roles that highlighted her sensuality even when the stories demanded more. Critics debated whether she was truly an actress or merely a presence. Some dismissed her as incapable of depth. Others argued that her very naturalness was a form of artistry beyond technique. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the blurred mirror. She was both more and less than what was said, both underestimated and overburdened. And what of Bardot herself, the woman behind the endless faces? Friends recalled her insecurities, her doubts about her talent, her conviction that people admired only her beauty and not her soul. In her quieter moments, she longed for recognition as more than a body, more than a myth, yet the mirror reflected back to her only what others wished to see. Could she ever separate her own vision of herself from the 1,000 versions imposed upon her? Perhaps this is why she grew restless, why she abandoned projects, why she often spoke of quitting cinema, even while the world begged her to stay. The mirror reflecting too many faces also reveals the burden of being an icon to women themselves. Young girls imitated her hair, her clothes, her walk, believing that in becoming like Bardot, they could also seize a piece of her freedom. Yet this imitation was double-edged, for it reinforced the idea that women must become images to be seen, that freedom was measured through beauty and desirability. Did Bardot feel pride in inspiring them, or guilt in knowing she was also reinforcing chains she herself despised? This ambiguity haunted her legacy, for she was both liberator and captive, both model and warning. In the quiet of her villa, surrounded by mirrors as every actress inevitably is, one can imagine her pausing, staring at her reflection, and seeing not one face but many. The face adored by admirers, the face condemned by moralists, the face compared to Monroe, the face doubted by critics, the face wept upon in solitude, and somewhere, hidden beneath, the true face, fragile, uncertain, perhaps even unknown to herself. Which of these faces was Brigitte Bardot? Was she all of them, or none? The mirror also revealed the passage of time. Fame is merciless in its obsession with youth, and even in her 20s, Bardot was already aware that her beauty, endlessly praised, was also a fleeting possession. Each line, each shadow upon her face would one day be magnified, criticized, used as evidence of decline. To live in the mirror was to live in the constant fear of time's betrayal. This awareness gnawed at her, driving her to moments of despair, making her question whether the love of millions was ever real or only a reflection of the youth they craved in her. And so, the mirror reflecting too many faces becomes not only a metaphor for Bardot's fame, but also for the contradictions of her age. She was a woman who embodied freedom, yet was bound by expectation, who inspired others yet felt empty herself, who was praised and condemned with equal fervor. Each face in the mirror belonged to someone else's story, someone else's judgment, someone else's desire. And she, standing before it, remained a mystery even to herself. We leave her here, then, in the dim room where the mirror reflects not clarity but confusion. Too many faces overlapping, dissolving, unresolved. She turns away, the glass still shimmering with ghosts of identity, leaving us with the unsettling awareness that no reflection can ever hold the truth of a soul. The waves endlessly crashing upon the shores of Saint-Tropez are the rhythm of eternity, always repeating, always reshaping, always erasing what was written in sand the day before. For Brigitte Bardot, those waves became a refuge, a sound that both calmed and haunted her. In Saint-Tropez, she found not only a sanctuary from the gaze of Paris and the relentless eyes of the press, but also a mirror of her own soul. Restless, ceaseless, breaking against the world and yet returning always to the sea. The village had once been little more than a quiet fishing port, its streets narrow, its houses sun-bleached, its harbor filled with wooden boats. Bardot's presence transformed it into a shrine of glamour, a place where artists, actors, and admirers flocked, drawn by the myth of the barefoot goddess who lived among the waves. The house she purchased there, La Madrague, became legendary, not because of its grandeur, but because of the woman who inhabited it. She filled it with animals, with music, with laughter and tears, and above all with her desire for a life free of the suffocating expectations of the city. In Saint-Tropez, Bardot walked barefoot on the beaches, her hair uncombed, her dresses simple, her body unadorned. She mingled with fishermen, with children, with strangers, unconcerned, or so it seemed, with the titles and hierarchies of society. Here she could be Brigitte rather than Bardot, though even in this refuge, photographers lingered at the edges, capturing her silhouette against the sea, ensuring that her sanctuary became yet another stage. But still, there was a difference. The waves gave her space to breathe, to rediscover some fragment of herself beyond the myth. Her relationship with the sea was not one of mere pleasure, but of kinship. She spoke often of her love for animals, for nature, for the untamed beauty of the world beyond human grasp. Saint-Tropez gave her these gifts: the scent of salt upon the wind, the cries of gulls, the warmth of sun upon skin not covered by costumes or cameras. These sensations grounded her, reminded her that she was part of something larger, something eternal, something indifferent to the applause or condemnation of men. Yet the waves also carried sorrow, for solitude, though healing, can also sharpen wounds. In Saint-Tropez, she confronted herself more directly than in the chaos of Paris, and in those quiet hours, the loneliness of her life pressed heavily upon her. Lovers came and went, their footsteps fading down corridors, their voices swallowed by the sea. Friends gathered in revelry but departed when the night ended. The sea remained constant, and in its constancy, it revealed the impermanence of all else. Did she, listening to its endless crashing, feel comforted or tormented by its reminder that all human struggles are fleeting? The transformation of Saint-Tropez into a place of glamour was itself a paradox. Bardot sought refuge there, yet her presence made it famous, drew crowds, turned its beaches into stages, its cafes into arenas of spectacle. The very sanctuary she longed for became another form of prison, filled with admirers who sought to glimpse her, to touch the air she breathed. Even as she walked barefoot, she was not unseen. And so the paradox deepened. Her search for anonymity only made her more visible. Her desire for peace created more noise. Her longing for simplicity generated greater complexity. Still, La Madrague became a symbol of her resistance, her attempt to live differently, to claim a corner of the world where she could define herself outside the rules of fame. There she cared for animals, especially dogs, cats, and later the beginnings of the activism that would define her later life. In the tenderness she gave to creatures who asked nothing of her but love, she found solace. For animals did not care about headlines, about scandals, about beauty or fame. They came to her for food, for warmth, for affection, and in giving these things, she reclaimed some fragment of her humanity that the world had tried to strip away. The waves endlessly crashing also became a sound woven into her films of that period. Directors, aware of her connection to Saint-Tropez, filmed her there, making the sea and the sun part of her myth. Audiences watching her upon the screen associated her with freedom, with the sensuality of nature, with the defiance of conventional life. The sea became her backdrop, her ally, her stage. And yet, as always, the screen betrayed the deeper truth. What appeared to others as liberation was often, for her, another mask, another reflection cast upon the water's surface, rippling but never showing the depths below. What does it mean to live beside the sea, to hear its voice daily, to see its endless horizon? For Bardot, perhaps it meant remembering that no fame, no scandal, no love affair was ever permanent. The sea erased footprints, erased whispers, erased even the loudest applause. It endured, indifferent to her struggles, and in that indifference lay both cruelty and comfort. To be forgotten by the sea is to be freed, yet also to be reminded of one's smallness. Did she find strength in this reminder, or did it deepen her despair at being unable to find lasting meaning in the life thrust upon her? We leave her here, then, upon the shore of Saint-Tropez, the waves endlessly crashing, the sunlight glinting upon the water, the cries of gulls mingling with the distant laughter of tourists. The sea is eternal, the village transformed, the villa filled with both silence and song. Bardot walks along the sand, her feet sinking into its softness, the water washing over her ankles. Around her the world watches, but within her the only sound is the endless rhythm of the waves, unresolved, repeating, reminding her that even myths are carried away by the tide. The slow extinguishing of a candle flame leaves behind a faint curl of smoke, a whisper of warmth fading into the chill of darkness. For Brigitte Bardot, this fragile image mirrors the shadows that crept into her life during the years when the applause softened, when the frenzy of fame turned inward, when the weight of being a symbol pressed too heavily upon her fragile spirit. Behind the dazzling surfaces of film posters and magazine covers, there burned within her a flame often threatened by despair, a flame she sometimes wished to extinguish altogether. Depression had accompanied her since youth, a companion as faithful as the applause of crowds, yet far more destructive. Sensitive, fragile, prone to sudden tears, Bardot was never fully armored against the demands of the life she had been given. Fame magnified her insecurities rather than erasing them, for the adoration of millions often feels less like love than like hunger, a hunger that devours rather than sustains. In her solitude, far from the lights of cinema, she wrestled with feelings of emptiness, of exhaustion, of being consumed and discarded. There were moments when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her entirely. On more than one occasion, Bardot attempted to end her life, unable to bear the contradictions that defined her existence. She had been raised in a world of discipline and expectation, thrust into the role of a global sex symbol, celebrated and condemned for the same qualities, desired by all and yet profoundly alone. How could one's spirit endure such relentless pressure without cracking? And so, In the stillness of her rooms, with curtains drawn and silence pressing close, she sought to extinguish her own flame. The world, of course, responded with its usual cruelty. When whispers of her suicide attempts surfaced, newspapers seized upon them, printing her despair in bold headlines, turning her most intimate struggles into public spectacle. Instead of compassion, she received judgment, accusations of selfishness, of weakness, of melodrama. Even her sorrow was not permitted to remain hers. It too was taken, twisted, scattered like ash upon the wind. What does it mean to cry out for peace when even one's suffering is transformed into entertainment for strangers? Yet the candle was not fully extinguished. Bardot survived these moments, sometimes pulled back by the love of those around her, sometimes by sheer chance, sometimes by the flicker of resilience that remained within. In surviving, she carried new scars, but also a deeper awareness of the fragility of life. She would later speak of these moments not with pride, but with stark honesty, admitting the weight of despair that had driven her, revealing that beneath the myth there was always a woman struggling to endure. The darkness of depression did not erase her beauty or her fame, but it colored them with a new depth. When audiences watched her on screen, they often sensed something behind the radiance, a shadow in her eyes, a melancholy beneath her laughter, a fragility that made her presence more than mere glamour. Perhaps it was this that captivated them, for beauty alone can dazzle, but beauty touched by sorrow pierces the soul. Was this, unknowingly, her greatest artistry, not in the roles she played, but in the truth she could not conceal? In Saint-Tropez, where she sought refuge, the darkness followed. The sea, eternal and indifferent, reflected her moods, sometimes lifting her spirits, sometimes deepening her isolation. Friends and lovers recalled her sudden shifts from joy to despair, from laughter to tears. She longed for freedom, yet she was bound by her own sensitivity, unable to shield herself from the cruelty of the world. Animals became her comfort, their silent companionship offering what human relationships could not: love without judgment, without demand, without betrayal. To stroke the fur of a dog, to hear the purr of a cat, was for her a kind of salvation, a reminder that tenderness could exist untainted. The slow extinguishing of the candle also symbolizes the passage of time, the realization that beauty, fame, and youth are fleeting. Bardot, though still young in these years, already felt the looming shadow of age, already feared the loss of what the world claimed to love in her. To be adored for one's beauty is to live under the constant threat of its departure. Did she, staring into mirrors lit by soft lamplight, see the lines beginning to form, the shadows deepening, and fear that the world would abandon her once the flame dimmed? This fear, combined with her fragility, surely deepened her despair. Yet it is also true that in surviving these moments of near extinction, Bardot found a strange kind of clarity. She began to question more openly the worth of fame, the hollowness of applause, the cruelty of public adoration. She spoke at times of her desire to leave cinema entirely, to retreat into a simpler life, to exchange the world's gaze for the companionship of animals and the constancy of the sea. These were not merely whims, but reflections born from the darkness, from the knowledge that the flame of fame could never warm the soul, as much as the gentle glow of private peace. The candle flame, once extinguished, leaves behind a faint trace of smoke, curling upward, dissolving into air. Bardot's moments of despair left such traces, whispers that lingered even when she returned to life. Friends noticed the shadow in her smile, the heaviness in her silences. Audiences, though unaware of the details, felt the echo of that smoke in her performances. And history, looking back, cannot ignore it, for the myth of Bardot is incomplete without acknowledging the darkness that nearly consumed her. And so we leave her here, in the dim room where the candle has burned low, its flame flickering, its smoke rising into the stillness. The silence is heavy, the air faintly scented with wax and sorrow. Outside, the sea continues its endless rhythm, indifferent, eternal. Inside, a woman sits in shadow, alive but fragile, the flame of her spirit not extinguished but trembling, unresolved, waiting for the next gust of wind, the next moment of light or darkness. Footsteps leaving a stage echo with a hollow weight, the sound of departure after the lights have dimmed, after the applause has faded, after the performance has ended. For Brigitte Bardot, such footsteps marked one of the most daring and enigmatic decisions of her life, to step away from cinema, to abandon the very stage that had made her immortal, and to retreat into a silence that bewildered admirers and critics alike. At the height of her fame, still radiant, still adored, she chose to turn her back on the art and industry that had both created and consumed her. Few stars in history have departed so abruptly, so completely, and at such a young age. Bardot was not fading when she left. She was still luminous, still able to command audiences with a glance, still the embodiment of sensual rebellion. Yet she felt weary of the endless cycle of scripts and scandals, of the cameras that devoured her soul, of the applause that never reached her heart. To walk away was not simply a career decision. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to allow herself to be consumed entirely by the machinery of fame. The world did not understand. Critics accused her of ingratitude, of abandoning her craft, of wasting her talent. Admirers begged her to return, unable to imagine cinema without her. But Bardot remained firm. She spoke of exhaustion, of disillusionment, of the desire to live a life beyond the screen. For too long she had been reduced to an image, a fantasy, a spectacle. She longed to reclaim her humanity, to step away from the stage where every gesture was magnified and every silence filled with speculation. Her final films carry a strange weight, as though they already bore the shadow of her departure. In Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt, 1963, she played a woman trapped in a marriage collapsing under the weight of art and commerce, her beauty dissected and commodified before the camera. Many saw in this role a reflection of Bardot herself, caught between personal longing and public demand. The film seemed to predict her eventual decision, her refusal to remain endlessly subjected to the gaze of others. The footsteps leaving the stage were not only physical, but symbolic. Bardot's departure signaled the end of an era, for she had been more than an actress. She had been a cultural phenomenon. Her exit left a void, a silence in which the world was forced to confront the fragility of its idols. If even Bardot could abandon fame, what did that say about the value of fame itself? Was it treasure, or was it poison? Was it a crown or a chain? Yet her departure was not merely escape. It was also a search for something else, something truer. Bardot turned her attention to causes that gave her life meaning beyond the applause of strangers. Animals, always her companions and confidants, became the center of her devotion. In caring for them, in defending them, she found a purpose untainted by spectacle. Unlike human admirers, animals did not demand performances or perfection. They asked only for kindness, for food, for safety. In giving these, Bardot reclaimed a fragment of her soul. Still, the world did not release her. Even after she stepped away, the fascination continued. Photographers lingered outside La Madrague. Journalists wrote stories about her retreat. Admirers speculated on her private life. The footsteps had left the stage, but the echo remained, carried into the world by memory and desire. Perhaps this is the fate of all icons. They cannot truly leave, for their image endures even in absence, perhaps even more powerfully than in presence. Imagine her then, walking away from a film set for the last time. The crew dismantles lights, the actors change out of costumes, the director prepares notes. Bardot slips quietly into the shadows, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors, each step both liberation and farewell. Behind her lies the noise of cinema. Ahead of her, the silence of a life yet unwritten. Did she feel fear, relief, a sense of loss? Or did she simply breathe for the first time in years, free of the suffocating air of the stage? Her decision resonates like a riddle. Was it courage to leave when the world begged her to stay? Or was it despair, an admission that she could no longer endure? Did she abandon cinema because she no longer believed in it, or because she no longer believed in herself? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the truth lies in the simple fact that she could not continue, and so she did not. The footsteps leaving the stage grow fainter now, fading into silence. Yet the silence is not empty. It is filled with questions, with echoes, with the memory of what has been left behind. For Bardot, the silence became a new life, a life without scripts or spotlights, a life lived closer to the earth, to the sea, to the creatures who did not demand that she be anything other than herself. And so we leave her here, stepping into the quiet beyond the stage, her figure retreating into shadows, her footsteps still faintly audible, unresolved. The stage remains empty, the lights dim, the audience uncertain whether the performance has ended or whether it has only transformed into something they cannot see. The distant cry of an animal carries through the air with a purity unshaped by artifice, untainted by human demands, a sound that asks for nothing but to be heard. For Brigitte Bardot, that cry became a summons, a call that drew her away from the glittering but suffocating world of cinema and into a new realm of purpose, where once she had been the muse of directors and the fantasy of millions, she now became the defender of creatures who had no voice. In turning to animals, she found a refuge, but also a cause, something greater than herself, something untouched by the cruelty of gossip and the corrosion of fame. Her love for animals had always been present, a quiet undercurrent beneath the storms of her life. Dogs and cats filled her home in Saint-Tropez, companions whose loyalty never wavered, whose affection asked nothing in return. Horses, birds, even the simplest of creatures seemed to draw her tenderness, as though she recognized in their innocence something she herself had long lost. Unlike the lovers who betrayed her or the critics who dissected her, animals gave without judgment and received without demand. In their eyes, she found the acceptance that the world had denied her. And so, as she stepped away from cinema, she turned her full attention to their plight. She spoke openly of their suffering, of the cruelty of hunting, of the horrors of slaughterhouses, of the silent agony endured by creatures treated as mere commodities. Many were surprised. How could the sex symbol of an era, the woman who embodied desire, transform into an activist who denounced the very structures of society's consumption? Yet perhaps it was not a transformation at all, but a return to the tenderness that had always existed beneath the masks forced upon her. Her activism was not gentle in tone. Bardot, once the object of whispers and sighs, became a voice of anger, of uncompromising conviction. She condemned practices long accepted as tradition, denounced hunters, confronted industries, called out politicians. The softness of her beauty was matched by the sharpness of her words, and in this, she revealed another paradox of her existence. The woman once worshipped for her sensuality now risked that adoration by speaking truths many did not wish to hear. Some admired her courage, others recoiled from her vehemence, but none could ignore her. The distant cry of animals resonated through her foundation, established to protect and advocate for them. She gave her wealth, her time, her energy to their defense. In doing so, she reshaped her legacy. No longer merely the face of the sexual revolution, she became a figure of moral rebellion, willing to sacrifice popularity for principle. This was perhaps her truest act of freedom, to speak not what the world wished to hear, but what she felt compelled to say. Yet even here, shadows remained. Bardot's activism, though noble in intent, was marked by controversy. Her language was often harsh, her comparisons provocative, her judgments absolute. Some accused her of extremism, of alienating those who might otherwise have listened. Others questioned her political associations, her occasional alignment with causes and figures that stirred discomfort. Was this the inevitable price of conviction, that in defending one truth she would be entangled in others more ambiguous, more troubling? The question lingers, unresolved, like the cry of an animal that echoes far but fades before one can locate its source. Still, her dedication to animals cannot be denied. While her cinema gradually receded into history, her work for animal rights became her daily reality. She rescued strays, campaigned against cruelty, lobbied for laws that would protect those who could not speak for themselves. For a woman once trapped in the endless gaze of humanity, it was perhaps a relief to live for creatures who cared nothing for her fame. To feed a hungry dog, to comfort a wounded horse, was to touch a form of purity she had rarely known in the human world. One wonders, though, whether this devotion was also a form of redemption. Did she seek, in saving animals, to save herself? Did she hope that by giving her life to them, she might find absolution for the chaos of her past, the broken marriages, the scandals, the despair? Or was it simply instinct, the natural flowering of a tenderness that had always been present, now allowed to take root once cinema no longer consumed her? Perhaps the truth is both. Perhaps in caring for animals, she both expressed her truest self and sought forgiveness from a world she could no longer bear. In Saint-Tropez, the distant cry of gulls mingled with the barking of dogs that filled her villa. Visitors recalled the chaos of animals everywhere. Cats sprawled across cushions, dogs racing through gardens, the air alive with the sounds of life unbound. For some, it seemed excessive, a retreat into eccentricity. For others, it was beautiful, a woman giving her love where it was most needed. For Bardot, it was simply survival. In the company of animals, she could breathe, she could rest, she could forget the endless demands of a world that had never let her simply be. Her life as an activist did not erase her past. The world continued to remember her films, to replay her roles, to compare her to other icons. But for Bardot herself, that life felt distant, like a dream fading in daylight. She once said that she had given her youth and beauty to men, and now gave her wisdom and experience to animals. In that statement lies the essence of her transformation. She had once been consumed, now she chose to give. The distant cry of an animal continues to echo, sometimes plaintive, sometimes fierce, always unresolved. It is the sound of innocence in peril, of beings forgotten in the rush of human ambition. For Bardot, that cry became her new stage, her new performance, though this time without applause, without lights, without scripts. It was not performance at all, but devotion, lived daily in the quiet corners of her villa, in the loud declarations of her activism, in the choices that defined her later years. And so we leave her here, surrounded by creatures who look at her not as a myth, but as a guardian, a friend, a source of comfort. The cry echoes still, carried by the wind across fields and seas, a reminder that even in the life of a woman once worshipped for her beauty, the truest legacy may lie in the tenderness given to those who cannot ask. Voices arguing in the distance carry with them a strange weight, the sound of conviction colliding with conviction, of words sharpened into weapons, of silence broken by discord. For Brigitte Bardot, such voices became a constant presence in her later life. for her transition from actress to activist did not deliver her into peace, but into new storms of controversy. Where once she had been condemned for her sensuality, she was now judged for her words, her causes, her uncompromising stance. She had left the stage of cinema only to find herself upon another, one far less forgiving, where applause was rare and criticism unrelenting. Her activism for animals, noble and heartfelt, often placed her at odds with powerful interests, hunters, farmers. Industries built upon the exploitation of animals bristled at her condemnations. Politicians found her demands inconvenient, her rhetoric unsettling. Bardot did not soften her voice to appease them. Instead, she spoke with increasing sharpness, unwilling to compromise, unwilling to dilute the urgency of her cause. Her words, like her presence on screen, carried passion. But this passion, when expressed in the public square, often created as much resistance as support. The voices arguing in the distance were not only those of her opponents, but also of her admirers, divided in their perception of her. Some praised her as courageous, a woman who had abandoned comfort to fight for the voiceless, who dared to say what others feared to whisper. Others recoiled from her harshness, from the extremity of her comparisons, from the political entanglements that occasionally accompanied her activism. For Bardot, it seemed that to speak was always to provoke, to ignite arguments that echoed far beyond her intentions. Her words about society, immigration, and culture in France drew particular fire. She spoke in ways that many found troubling, aligning herself at times with voices on the far right of politics. For those who had once celebrated her as a symbol of liberation, these declarations were bewildering, even painful. How could the woman who embodied freedom now be accused of intolerance? Was she betraying the very ideals she had once represented, or was she simply speaking truths as she saw them, regardless of how they were received? The arguments swirled, unresolved as they still do, leaving her legacy entangled in contradiction. Perhaps it was inevitability. A woman who had always lived in extremes, who had never been able to inhabit moderation, could hardly be expected to speak with quiet diplomacy in her later years. Just as her performances on screen carried raw authenticity, so too did her declarations in public life. She did not measure her words for effect. She spoke as she felt, and the world reacted as it always had. Some with adoration, some with condemnation, all with intensity. The arguments also revealed something deeper: Bardot's refusal to be forgotten. Having walked away from cinema, she might have faded quietly into the background of history. But Bardot was not made for quiet withdrawal. Her voice, whether through films or causes, was destined to be heard, even when it invited anger. Perhaps she knew that controversy, though painful, also ensured her presence, her relevance, her impact. Or perhaps she simply could not help herself, her temperament too fierce, her convictions too strong to be hidden. Imagine her then, speaking at a gathering, her voice firm, her gaze unflinching, as those around her shift uncomfortably or argue back. She does not retreat. She does not apologize. Her words, once whispered in film dialogue, now strike with the clarity of declarations. Some applaud, others shake their heads, but all listen. The room vibrates with tension, with voices raised in opposition or support, with the undeniable presence of a woman who refuses silence. The voices arguing in the distance also echo within her own being. For Bardot was not immune to doubt, to reflection, to the weight of knowing her words carried consequences. In private, she wrestled with the knowledge that she had divided opinion, that she had wounded as well as inspired. Yet she did not retract. She seemed to accept that to live authentically was to invite conflict, that peace bought at the price of silence was no peace at all. In this, she remained consistent with the woman she had always been, fragile in spirit yet fierce in expression. Her later years became a chorus of these arguments, Each new declaration brought headlines, each new controversy renewed the debates about who she truly was. Some insisted she was still the icon of freedom, only misunderstood. Others declared she had become bitter, hardened, even reactionary. The truth, as always, lay in the shadows between, in the complexity of a woman who could never be reduced to a single image, a single role, a single conviction. The distant voices rise, clash, and fade, yet they never resolve into harmony. They leave behind an echo, a question. How should one remember Bardot? As the goddess of liberation, or as the provocateur of later years? As the tender protector of animals, or as the harsh critic of society? Perhaps the answer is that she is all of these, that her contradictions are inseparable from her truth. For to demand consistency from Bardot is to misunderstand her. She was never consistent, never confined, never still. And so we leave her here, surrounded by voices arguing in the distance, some praising, some condemning, all unresolved. The arguments drift across the air like waves of sound, never ceasing, never silent. They form the soundtrack of her later years, replacing the applause of cinema with the harsher music of public debate. And in the midst of it all, Bardot remains, unmoved, unrepentant, her voice still clear, her presence still undeniable, her legacy still a question without answer. A dress left abandoned on a chair carries the faint memory of a body that once filled it, the warmth of movement still lingering in its folds, the perfume of evenings gone. For Brigitte Bardot, such an image recalls the legacy of her films, her fashion, her influence, all of which remained even after she had stepped away. The dress symbolized more than fabric. It was a relic of the revolution she embodied, a reminder of the woman who once walked boldly across the stage of history and then vanished, leaving behind the shape of her presence in the culture she transformed. The legacy of Bardot in cinema is complex. She was never merely an actress performing lines on a page. She was the embodiment of an era's shifting values, its restless longings, its contradictions. Through her films, she redefined femininity not as compliance, but as defiance, not as submission, but as an unashamed inhabiting of desire. Directors sought to capture her wildness, her authenticity, her refusal to bow to conventions. Even when the scripts were thin, even when the roles were little more than excuses to showcase her body, she managed to turn them into statements, deliberate or not, about freedom and rebellion. Her influence extended far beyond the screen. The way she dressed became a language, a code that young women across the world imitated. The bikini, once scandalous, became common after she wore it. Her tousled hair, her smoky eyes, her casual chic turned into global trends. Bardot was not simply performing in films, she was living as though the camera were always present. And in doing so, she set the style of a generation. The dress abandoned on the chair is therefore not merely hers, but belongs to millions of women who tried to step into it, to feel, if only for a moment, the freedom she seemed to carry so effortlessly. And yet, even as she was hailed as a liberator, questions lingered. Did Bardot truly free women, or did she reinforce the chains of desirability? For while she embodied rebellion, she was also framed constantly through the lens of male desire, her body commodified, her beauty endlessly dissected. Feminists debated her meaning. Some saw in her a figure of empowerment, a woman who lived by her own rules, who refused to submit to society's expectations. Others argued that she was merely another object of male fantasy, that her so-called freedom was still confined within the boundaries of being desired. Which interpretation is true? Perhaps both, for the truth of Bardot lies always in contradiction. Her influence on music was equally profound. Serge Gainsbourg, inspired by her, wrote songs that carried her name and spirit, melodies infused with sensuality and provocation. Her presence in the world of song extended her myth beyond cinema, weaving her into the very soundscape of her age. Painters painted her, writers described her, photographers chased her. She was not only a woman, but a symbol scattered across every medium, every art, every imagination that sought to capture the elusive essence of modernity. And yet, the dress left abandoned on the chair reminds us of absence as well as presence. For Bardot chose to leave, to retreat, to live a life away from the screen. Her legacy is thus one of fragments, of films that remain but are finite, of images preserved but not renewed. Unlike other stars who prolong their careers, adapting to new roles, Bardot remains forever young in memory, preserved at the moment of her departure. The dress will never again be worn upon the stage. It will remain on the chair, a relic of what was and what will never return. This absence perhaps intensified her myth. By leaving early, she avoided the decline, the fading into roles of secondary importance, the erosion of youth under the unforgiving eye of the camera. She remains eternally the Bardot of the 1950s and 1960s, untainted by the passage of time in the cinematic imagination. And yet, this eternal youth is itself a distortion, for it denies the fullness of her humanity, the years of aging, of change, of activism, of controversy. The dress abandoned on the chair is beautiful, but it no longer fits the woman who has grown beyond it. Cultural memory is strange in its selectivity. Bardot's films, while popular in their time, were not always critically acclaimed. Many were dismissed as trivial, shallow, designed only to showcase her allure. And yet her influence has endured far more powerfully than that of many critically lauded works. Why? Perhaps because Bardot herself was the art, the living sculpture, the performance that transcended the films themselves. The scripts may fade, the plots may be forgotten, but her presence endures, as immediate today as it was decades ago. And so the question lingers, what is her true legacy? Is it liberation or illusion? Did she change the world or merely reflect changes already underway? Did she empower women or reinforce their confinement within the gaze of men? History offers no simple answers. The dress on the chair carries the scent of liberation, but it also carries the imprint of expectation, of objectification, of longing unfulfilled. To step into it is to inherit both freedom and burden, both joy and sorrow. Imagine her walking past that chair, pausing for a moment, glancing at the dress she once wore. Does she smile with nostalgia, remembering the nights of laughter, the applause, the whispered adoration? Or does she turn away, weary of the memory, relieved to have left it behind? Perhaps both, for the past is always both sweetness and bitterness, both warmth and wound. And so we leave her here, the dress still draped across the chair, silent, waiting, carrying the ghost of movement that will never return. The room is quiet, the air faintly perfumed, the absence palpable. The dress is both a relic and a reminder, unresolved, suspended between presence and loss, like her legacy itself, forever debated, never fully defined, eternally abandoned, yet never forgotten. A record turning endlessly on a gramophone fills the room with music that loops into eternity. Its needle tracing the same grooves again and again, carrying voices from the past into the present. For Brigitte Bardot, this turning record is a fitting image of how new generations have discovered her, not as a living woman walking barefoot through the streets of Saint-Tropez, but as a sound, a face, an image replayed, reinterpreted, never ending. Her legacy spins like that record, repeating the same songs, the same films, the same photographs, reaching ears and eyes that were not yet born when she first stepped into the light. Young audiences, far removed from the 1950s and 1960s, encounter Bardot through grainy black and white stills, through clips on glowing screens, through music that carries her name like a refrain. They see her hair, her eyes, her effortless sensuality, and though the world around them has changed, something in her presence still speaks. Perhaps it is the rawness, the naturalness, the refusal to be sculpted into perfection that resonates in an age weary of polish. Perhaps it is simply the aura of authenticity, of a woman who, despite contradictions, lived without disguise. The record turns, and with it echoes the voices of those who celebrated her, those who condemned her, those who sought to define her. Serge Gainsbourg's songs, written for her and about her, still play, their melodies carrying her spirit into ears that know her only as myth. Fashion houses still cite her as inspiration, her style reappearing in new forms, her hair imitated in glossy magazines decades after she abandoned the stage. Like the record, she continues to spin, her influence looping through time. Yet each generation hears her differently. For those who lived through her rise, she was scandal, rebellion, liberation. For those who came later, she is nostalgia, a symbol of a bygone era, a glamorous myth preserved in amber. And for the youngest, who know her only through fragments of images and songs, she is something almost fictional, a character from history rather than a woman of flesh and blood. Each hearing of the record is colored by the listener, each spin a reinterpretation of the same grooves. There is a paradox in this repetition. The more her image is replayed, the more it risks becoming detached from the woman herself. Bardot, now older, withdrawn from cinema, is not the Bardot the world remembers. The record turns, but it does not age. The grooves remain as they were, preserving youth, beauty, rebellion. The woman herself moves forward in time, but the myth is frozen, replayed endlessly. Does she feel estranged from this version of herself? This eternal Bardot who dances forever on screens, laughs forever in photographs, sings forever in recordings? Perhaps the estrangement is sharp, for to live while one's image remains unchanging is to feel one's own mortality heightened. And yet there is comfort too. The record turning endlessly ensures that she is never forgotten, that her presence endures beyond the fragile boundaries of a human life. Few are granted such immortality, to be remembered not only in history books, but in the textures of culture, in songs and styles and dreams. That is both a burden and a gift. The grooves of the record may be finite, but their repetitions are infinite, carrying her into the future again and again. Imagine a young woman in some distant city, decades after Bardot left cinema, placing a record on a gramophone, hearing the crackle of the needle as it catches the groove. The song begins, carrying Bardot's voice, or a song written for her, or simply an echo of her presence. The young listener closes her eyes and is transported to Saint-Tropez, to Paris, to the 1960s. She sees Bardot in her mind's eye, walking barefoot, laughing, defiant. She feels a connection to a woman she has never met, who belongs to another age, and yet who seems alive before her. This is the power of the turning record. It collapses time, it makes the past present, it ensures that Bardot remains always new. But even as the record turns, there is always the question of distortion. A record wears with time, grooves deepen, scratches appear, the sound warps. Each replay is both preservation and erosion. So too with Bardot's legacy. Each retelling of her story, each new interpretation of her films and life, carries the risk of distortion. The scandals are magnified, the complexities simplified, the controversies emphasized or ignored according to the needs of the moment. What remains true and what is lost in the noise? Perhaps no one can say, for all memory is like a record, faithful yet flawed, enduring yet fragile. The endless spinning also reminds us of the impossibility of closure. Bardot's story cannot be sealed, for each generation reopens it, asks new questions, draws new meanings. Was she feminist or anti-feminist? Victim or victor? Liberator or object? The answers shift with time, with culture, with perspective. The record never stops. It plays again and again, and with each turn the song is heard differently. And so the record turning endlessly on a gramophone becomes the image of Bardot's afterlife in culture. She is not present, yet she is never absent. She's left the stage, yet her performance continues. The grooves are set, the music written, but the listening is perpetual, unending. She is both frozen and alive, both past and present, both human and myth. We leave her here, then, in the room where the record spins, the needle tracing its circle, the sound filling the air. Outside, the world moves forward, but inside the room, the past is always present, always playing, always unresolved. The record turns, and with each turn, Bardot is reborn, a myth repeating into eternity. A window closing softly is not a sound of violence, but of retreat, of withdrawal, of the quiet wish to keep the world at bay. For Brigitte Bardot, this soft closing became the gesture of her later years, as she withdrew more and more from the gaze of the public, retreating into her home, her animals, her solitude. The woman who had once embodied openness, who walked barefoot on beaches, who allowed the world to gaze upon her as though she were its own, now chose distance. The stage was long behind her, the applause a memory, and what remained was the silence of a life lived behind closed shutters, looking out only when she wished. Old age, for Bardot, arrived not as a gentle transformation but as a confrontation. The world remembered her eternally young, eternally radiant, eternally rebellious. The photographs, the films, the songs preserved her in a perpetual state of beauty, a woman forever frozen in the 1960s. Yet the real Bardot aged, her face lined, her body changed, her vitality tempered by time. This dissonance between myth and reality was cruel, for the public, accustomed to her as an icon, struggled to reconcile the wrinkles of age with the luminous girl of Saint-Tropez. And Bardot, sensitive as she had always been, felt the sting of this comparison keenly. She spoke often, in interviews, of her discomfort with the loss of beauty, of her resentment toward time's inevitability. She had been celebrated for her youth, her allure, her sensuality. What then remained when those gifts faded? To live as a myth is to suffer when the myth cannot be maintained. Bardot confronted this truth with candor, admitting her despair at aging, her struggle to find value beyond the surface. Some found her honesty refreshing, others saw it as vanity. But beneath both interpretations lay the fragile truth of a woman who had been defined by her image and now found herself estranged from it. The window closing softly also symbolizes her retreat into privacy. In her villa, surrounded by animals, she created a sanctuary where the outside world could not intrude. She no longer sought the spotlight, no longer courted attention, no longer cared for the opinions of critics or admirers. Instead, she devoted herself to her causes, her animals, her garden, her music. The once public woman became private. The once approachable goddess became distant. Yet in this retreat she found a kind of peace that had long eluded her. For behind the closed window she was no longer Bardot the myth, but Brigitte the woman. Still the world did not release her. Journalists continued to seek her out, eager for statements, for photographs, for glimpses of the woman who had once shaken the world. And when she spoke, her words carried weight, often igniting controversy, often provoking debates. Her voice, sharper now, reflected her unwillingness to soften with age. She had no patience for diplomacy, no desire to please. The woman who had once embodied sensuality now embodied defiance of another kind, defiance against the world's attempts to dictate what she should say, think or believe. The window was closed, but her voice still carried beyond it, sometimes like a whisper, sometimes like a shout. Her old age also revealed the persistence of contradictions. She was tender to animals, fierce in her advocacy, but harsh toward human society, often critical, sometimes bitter. She was admired for her devotion to her causes, but criticized for her political stances, her bluntness, her refusal to align with the expectations of her admirers. Some were disappointed, as though the icon of youth should have remained forever a symbol of progress and liberation. But Bardot, as always, refused to be confined. She was herself, with all her flaws and contradictions, and she seemed almost to embrace the discomfort she caused. What does it mean to grow old when one has been the embodiment of youth? For Bardot, it meant confronting daily the dissonance between memory and reality. Her image, preserved in photographs and films, remained forever radiant. The woman herself aged, weakened, suffered the illnesses and pains of time. Perhaps this is why she chose to close the window softly, to retreat into a private world where the comparison could not torment her daily. In solitude, she could live not as an icon, but as a woman, not as a memory, but as a presence. And yet, the myth endures. Younger generations discovering her through old films still see her as she was, not as she is. They place posters of her on their walls, imitate her style, play her songs. For them, Bardot remains eternally young, eternally rebellious, eternally free. The window may be closed, but the world continues to gaze upon her through the images left behind. And perhaps this is the final paradox of her life. She sought privacy, but her myth remains public. She sought to close the window, but the world still peers through the glass, seeing not her present self, but the ghost of her past. Imagine her sitting in her villa, the window closed softly, the sunlight filtered through curtains, the cries of gulls muffled, the sea still audible, but distant. Around her, dogs sleep, cats wander, the quiet of the house broken only by the sounds of life she has chosen to surround herself with. She holds a cup of tea, or perhaps simply rests her hands upon her knees, gazing into silence. She is no longer the woman of the screen, no longer the scandal of newspapers, no longer the goddess of liberation. She is Brigitte, old, frail, yet still stubbornly herself. The world outside continues to argue, to remember, to mythologize. Inside, the window closed, she breathes quietly, simply, finally. And so we leave her here, behind the softly closed window, the air heavy with the scent of animals, the faint rhythm of the sea, the weight of years pressing gently but firmly upon her shoulders. The world may clamor, but the room is still. The window holds back the noise, leaving only the sound of her own breathing, unresolved, fragile, human. A question left unspoken lingers heavier than any answer, for it circles the mind, haunts the silence, and refuses closure. In the life of Brigitte Bardot, many such questions remain, unresolved, hovering like faint shadows over her legend. Was she saint or sinner, victim or victor, a creature liberated or one perpetually confined? Did she embody freedom, or did she reveal its impossibility? The world asked these questions of her endlessly, yet she herself seldom provided answers, preferring instead to live, to stumble, to retreat, to provoke, and to leave the riddle intact. Those who knew her intimately spoke of a woman of extremes, tender yet mercurial, radiant yet melancholy, fiercely loyal yet capable of sudden departure. They described her as sensitive to cruelty, especially toward animals, yet often harsh toward people, unwilling to forgive slights, unwilling to bend. Was this contradiction, hypocrisy, or simply the complexity of a spirit too large to fit within any single role? Perhaps Bardot herself did not know, for her life seems less a series of clear choices than a restless movement between poles, forever searching for a place to rest. Her critics framed her as a selfish figure, a woman who left broken hearts in her wake, who relished scandal, who later embraced divisive views that tarnished her earlier image of liberation. Her admirers, in contrast, saw in her a woman who refused to compromise, who lived authentically regardless of cost, who gave her later life to causes that asked nothing of her but compassion. Which view is true? Both and neither. Bardot was too vast a figure, too contradictory a presence, to be reduced to a single interpretation. The question remains, unspoken yet unavoidable. Who was Brigitte Bardot? Really? Even in her own reflections, she often spoke with ambiguity. She admitted her despair at aging, her discomfort with fame, her hatred of the gaze that consumed her. And yet she acknowledged that without it, she might have been nothing, forgotten, ordinary. She confessed to loving love itself, to needing passion as one needs air, yet also spoke of the destruction it brought her, the loneliness it carved into her life. She claimed to detest politics, yet her voice entered it with vehemence. She expressed regret at times, yet also defiance, insisting she would not have lived differently. What does one make of such contradictions? Perhaps they reveal that she herself lived with the same unanswered questions that we now ask of her. A question left unspoken is also an invitation to reflect, to imagine, to construct one's own version of the truth. Bardot became, in this way, a canvas upon which society painted its desires and fears. For some, she was the ultimate temptress, dangerous and alluring. For others, she was the innocent victim of exploitation, her fragility consumed by an unkind world. For still others, she was a symbol of rebellion, a woman who rejected the roles imposed upon her. Each interpretation says as much about the observer as it does about Bardot herself. She was a mirror, and each gaze revealed more about those who looked than about the woman herself. This is perhaps why her story endures, why it continues to provoke debate long after she has retreated from the stage. If Bardot were simple, if she were wholly victim or wholly victor, wholly liberator or wholly captive, her story might have ended cleanly. But because she is none of these entirely, and all of them in fragments, she remains alive in memory, unresolved. The question left unspoken keeps her myth breathing, keeps her presence alive, keeps her figure walking the beaches of our imagination, even as she closes the window of her villa against the world. Imagine her then, in a moment of solitude, sitting quietly, hearing the sea through shutters half drawn. Around her, animals move softly, a dog stretching in the sun, a cat curling into sleep. She gazes out, her face lined by time, her hair silvered, her eyes still holding the shadow of that young woman who once scandalized the world. Does she herself wonder who she has been? Does she look back upon her films, her loves, her causes, and ask the same questions we ask? Or does she simply let them pass, unwilling to pursue answers that can never be found? The silence does not say, and in that silence lies her final mystery. The unspoken question also extends beyond Bardot herself, reaching into the heart of her era. What did she mean to the 20th century? Was she a herald of liberation or a symptom of society's obsession with desire? Did she truly change the world, or did she simply reflect its hidden longings back to it? The record of her life does not resolve these questions. It merely offers fragments, contradictions, suggestions. The world may never know, and perhaps it does not need to, for the power of Bardot lies not in definitive answers, but in the ambiguity she leaves behind. And so we leave her here, surrounded not by applause or condemnation, but by silence, filled with unspoken questions. They hover in the air like smoke, intangible, impossible to grasp, yet refusing to dissipate. They remind us that some lives are not meant to be understood fully, that some figures remain enigmas, not because they hide, but because they reveal too much, too many contradictions for the mind to settle. The question left unspoken is the essence of Bardot, unresolved, eternal, waiting for each new listener, each new admirer, each new critic to give it shape. The sea of Saint-Tropez at dusk is a canvas of fading light, its waters touched by gold, then crimson, then deep violet as the sun sinks into the horizon. It is here, in this quiet hour, that the life of Brigitte Bardot seems most fittingly remembered, not in the glare of cinema lights or the clamor of scandal, but in the gentle rhythm of waves dissolving into twilight. For she, too, was a being of light and shadow, dazzling in her radiance, restless in her depths, and finally at peace only when the day drew to a close. To recall her story is to recall the contradictions of the 20th century itself. She rose from a disciplined Parisian childhood to become the embodiment of rebellion, from ballet slippers to the barefoot goddess of Saint-Tropez. She turned from the innocence of youth into the scandal of an God-created woman, a performance that split the world into awe and outrage. She lived loves that burned brightly and ended with the slam of doors, affairs that brought both tenderness and despair. She was adored, condemned, imitated, misunderstood. She retreated into the sanctuary of La Madrague, where waves became her constant companions, where animals filled the spaces that human love had left empty. She survived despair, endured controversy, embraced activism, and grew old behind softly closed windows. Through it all, the world continued to gaze upon her, unable to decide whether she was savior or destroyer, muse or rebel, victim or victor. The dusk sea reflects all of this, shifting colors, contradictions held together in one seamless expanse. One moment it is luminous, the next it is shadowed. One moment it appears infinite, the next it vanishes into night. To watch it is to understand something of Bardot's essence. Never one thing, never fixed, always changing, always defying clarity. Her legacy, like the sea at dusk, is a mystery that invites contemplation more than resolution. Did she free women by living openly, by refusing to bow to conventions, by embodying desire without apology? Or did she entrench the idea that a woman's worth lies in her beauty, her body, her desirability? Did she retreat from cinema as an act of courage, refusing to be consumed, or as an act of despair, unable to endure its demands? Did her later activism redeem her, or did her controversial words stain what had once seemed pure? The sea does not answer. It reflects only what we project upon it, as Bardot herself reflected the desires and fears of her time. Perhaps that is the lesson her life leaves us with, that some figures are not meant to be resolved, that their power lies in the questions they leave behind. Bardot's beauty was fleeting, yet it endures. Her films may not all be remembered as masterpieces, yet her presence within them remains unforgettable. Her activism may be contested, yet her devotion to animals is undeniable. She was fragile, yet she was fierce. She was wounded, yet she was defiant. She was a myth, yet always painfully human. At dusk, as the sea darkens, one can imagine her standing on the shore of Saint-Tropez, her hair silvered by age, her body frail, but her eyes still carrying the spark of the young woman who once walked barefoot into the world's gaze. Around her, the cries of gulls fade, the waves soften, the air cools. She is alone, yet not lonely, for the sea, the animals, the silence are companions enough. She has lived her life, given her youth to cinema, her middle years to love and despair, her later years to animals and causes. What remains now is simply being, existing in the twilight, awaiting the night without fear. And for us who look back upon her, the sea at dusk is a reminder that memory itself is like water, fluid, shifting, never fixed. We remember Bardot differently depending on where we stand, depending on the light of our time. She is never the same figure twice, never entirely one thing or another. She is like the waves, sometimes dazzling, sometimes turbulent, sometimes calm, but always returning, always present. The sea darkens further, the last glow of sun fading. Bardot's myth dissolves into the horizon, yet it does not vanish. It lingers like the sound of waves heard long after one has left the shore. It lingers in films still watched, in photographs still admired, in songs still sung, in debates still argued. It lingers in the very questions we cannot answer, the mysteries we cannot resolve. She remains, even in absence, even in silence, even as the night falls. And so we leave her here, in the sea of Saint-Tropez at dusk, her figure fading into shadow, her story suspended between light and darkness. The waves continue their endless rhythm, unresolved, eternal, carrying with them the memory of a woman who shook the world, who lived as flame and shadow, who remains a question without answer, a myth without conclusion.